Picture this: you are sitting in a meeting, and your boss gives you feedback that is actually pretty constructive, but your heart starts racing, like you are about to be executed. Your palms sweat. Your mind spirals into catastrophic thoughts about losing your job, disappointing everyone, proving you are a failure. Here is the thing that'll blow your mind. That reaction isn't about your boss or your job at all. It is about something that happened decades ago, when you were small and vulnerable, learning the most dangerous lesson a child can learn, that your worth depends on being perfect. You see, there is this boy I want to tell you about. He never experienced what most people would call real trauma. No dramatic abuse, no life-threatening situations, no obvious villains in his story. But every single day, he lived with something far more insidious: the slow, steady erosion of his sense of self-worth. Every evening at dinner, he'd watch his parents' faces, desperately searching for a sign that he mattered. Maybe a genuine smile, a question about his day that wasn't just polite noise, or God forbid, someone actually listening to his answer. But mostly, he got distracted nods, phones being checked, and conversations that flowed around him, like he was furniture. Nobody ever told him he was worthless directly. That would have been too obvious, too easy to identify and fight against. Instead, the message came in whispers, in the way his excitement about a drawing was met with, "That is nice, honey," without anyone actually looking at it, in how his tears over a playground conflict were brushed off with "you are being too sensitive," in the way love felt like something he had to earn through good grades, perfect behavior, and never ever being inconvenient. That boy is now 43. He has got a successful career, a beautiful family, and a life that looks absolutely perfect from the outside. But here is what nobody sees. He still carries that invisible child everywhere he goes. The one who learned that safety was temporary, love was conditional, and worth had to be proven over and over again. And here is the part that'll make your skin crawl with recognition. This isn't just his story. It is the hidden epidemic of our time. You want to know what childhood trauma really looks like? It is not always the dramatic stories that make headlines. Sometimes it is growing up in a house where emotions were treated like dangerous weather systems to be avoided at all costs, where vulnerability was met with discomfort or dismissal, where you learn to read every micro expression on your parents' faces to gauge your safety for the day. Your nervous system doesn't care that your parents did their best or that other people had it worse. Your brain was forming its fundamental understanding of reality during those early years, and if that reality felt unpredictable, emotionally barren, or conditional, then congratulations. You've been carrying invisible wounds that are still bleeding decades later. Here is what neuroscience has discovered that changes everything. Your childhood doesn't just give you memories. It literally sculpts your brain architecture. Every interaction, every moment of safety or danger, every experience of being seen or ignored becomes hardwired into your neural pathways. When you experienced consistent emotional safety as a child, your brain developed what researchers call secure attachment patterns. You learn that the world is generally trustworthy, that relationships are sources of comfort, and that you have inherent worth regardless of your performance. But if your childhood was characterized by emotional neglect, inconsistent caregiving, or conditional love, your brain developed entirely different patterns. Your amygdala, that ancient alarm system, became hypervigilant, constantly scanning for threats. Your nervous system learned to expect rejection, abandonment, or criticism around every corner. And here is the truly devastating part. These patterns don't just affect how you feel. They affect how you perceive reality itself. You might walk into a room and immediately sense hostility where none exists. You might interpret a partner's quiet moment as evidence they're planning to leave. You might work yourself into exhaustion trying to prove you deserve the job you've already earned. This is why traditional advice like, "just think positive" or "get over," it is not just useless, it is actually harmful. You can't think your way out of patterns that live in your nervous system. It is like trying to reason with your heartbeat. Let me tell you something that might shock you. Some of the most successful, accomplished people you know are running on childhood trauma fuel. They've turned their wounds into superpowers, but at a cost that is slowly killing them. The perfectionist who can't rest because rest feels like giving up. Childhood trauma, the people, Pleaser who says yes to everything and everyone except themselves. Childhood trauma. The workaholic who measures their worth in achievements because they never learned they had inherent value. You guessed it, childhood trauma. These adaptations worked brilliantly when you were 7 years old and dependent on unpredictable caregivers for survival. But now, they're the very things keeping you trapped in patterns that feel both familiar and suffocating. But here is where I need to blow your mind with something most people never realize. The greatest punishment of childhood trauma isn't the pain you remember. It is not the anxiety, the depression, or even the relationship struggles that everyone talks about. The real punishment is this: you never got to discover who you actually are underneath all those survival strategies. Think about it. While other kids were learning to play freely, you were learning to perform. While they were developing authentic preferences, you were developing radar for what other people wanted from you. While they were building genuine self-esteem, you were building an elaborate system of earning worth through external validation. You've spent your entire life being the person you thought you needed to be to stay safe, loved, and accepted. But who are you when you are not performing? What do you actually want when you are not trying to please everyone else? What would your life look like if you made decisions based on your authentic desires rather than your childhood programming? Most people never find out because they never stop running the old programs long enough to ask these questions. Now, I know what you are thinking. This all sounds incredibly depressing, like you are doomed to spend your entire life as a prisoner of your past, repeating patterns you never consciously chose. But here is where the story takes a turn that might change everything for you. Remember that boy I told you about, the one who grew up invisible and spent decades trying to prove his worth through achievement. Something shifted for him in his early 40s. Not through some dramatic breakthrough or expensive therapy, though those can help. It happened through a series of small, almost mundane realizations. He started noticing the voice in his head, the one that had been narrating his life for decades with a constant stream of criticism, worry, and self-doubt. For the first time, he realized that voice wasn't him. It was the internalized voice of his childhood environments, still trying to keep him safe in ways that no longer served him. He began to understand that the love he'd been chasing his entire adult life, through promotions, relationships, achievements, couldn't actually fill the void left by his childhood, because that void wasn't created by lack of external validation. It was created by the absence of unconditional self-acceptance. This is where the science gets really interesting. Neuroplasticity research shows us that your brain remains changeable throughout your entire life. Those neural pathways carved by childhood experiences aren't permanent highways. They're more like well-worn paths through a forest. And with conscious effort, you can create new paths. But here is the catch that most self-help approaches miss completely. You can't heal trauma by bypassing it. You can't think your way out of nervous system dysregulation. You can't logic your way past emotional wounds that live in your body. Real healing requires something much more radical. You have to learn to become the parent to yourself that you needed as a child. I know that sounds like therapy. Speak nonsense, but stick with me. When you were small and afraid, what did you need? Probably someone to see your fear, validate it, and help you feel safe. Someone to tell you that your feelings mattered, that you were worthy of love just as you were, that you didn't have to be perfect to belong. You can give yourself these things now, not through imagination or positive affirmations, but through concrete actions that communicate safety to your nervous system. When you notice that familiar anxiety rising in your chest, instead of pushing through it or judging yourself for having it, you can pause. You can put your hand on your heart and acknowledge, this is scary right now, and that is okay. I am safe in this moment. When you catch yourself in the old pattern of overgiving or people pleasing, you can ask, what does the young part of me think will happen if I disappoint this person? And then you can remind that part, I don't need to earn love anymore. I can set boundaries and still be worthy of care. This isn't about becoming self-indulgent or narcissistic. It is about developing the internal relationship that should have been modeled for you in childhood. It is about learning to be your own secure base. But let me tell you something that might surprise you. Your childhood wounds, once healed, can become your greatest strengths. That hypervigilance that makes you anxious. It can transform into extraordinary intuition and emotional intelligence. That perfectionism that exhausts you. It can become a capacity for excellence and attention to detail that sets you apart. That sensitivity that feels like a burden. It can become the ability to create art, offer profound empathy, and see beauty that others miss. The key is healing, the fear that drives these traits so they can express themselves as gifts rather than compulsions. Here is something I want you to try tonight, after this video ends. Find a quiet moment and ask yourself, if I knew I was unconditionally worthy of love and belonging, how would I live differently? Would you take that creative risk you've been avoiding? Would you set that boundary you've been too afraid to establish? Would you finally pursue that dream you've been telling yourself you are not good enough for? Your childhood trauma taught you to live small, to play it safe, to earn your place in the world through performance rather than authenticity. But you have the power to teach yourself something different now. Every time you choose courage over comfort, authenticity over approval, self-compassion over self-criticism, you are literally rewiring your brain. You are showing your nervous system that it is safe to be who you actually are. And here is the beautiful paradox. When you stop trying so hard to be worthy, you discover that you always were. When you stop performing for love, you realize that real love was never about performance in the first place. The punishment of childhood trauma is indeed lifelong, but so is the opportunity for healing, growth, and transformation. Your past shaped you, but it doesn't have to define your future. You get to decide what your story means. You get to choose how your chapters end, and you get to become the author of everything that comes next. Because the truth is, your childhood trauma isn't just something you survived. It is also the source of your deepest wisdom, your greatest compassion, and your most authentic strength. The cracks in your foundation aren't structural damage. They're where the light gets in. And once you learn to see those cracks as openings rather than flaws, everything changes. The punishment transforms into possibility. The wound becomes the birthplace of your power. Your inner child has been waiting decades for someone to finally see them, hear them, and tell them they matter. That someone is you. And it is never too late to give them what they've always deserved: unconditional love, unwavering acceptance, and the promise that they'll never be abandoned again. The story doesn't end with the trauma. It begins with what you choose to do with it now.